Good morning, everyone. This is Kathleen Newland speaking to you from the Migration Policy Institute in Washington. I'm the co-founder of the Institute and a senior fellow here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on building an evidence base to support refugee resettlement. We're going to have a very interesting discussion this morning, which includes 4 presenters. I'll introduce them more fully as they speak, but initially I'll just tell you that our 4 speakers will be Susan Fratsky, a policy analyst and program coordinator in the international program here at MPI, Hannah Behrens, who's associate director of MPI Europe in Brussels, Oscar Ekblad, the head of the Swedish Resettlement Program at the Swedish Migration Board in Stockholm, and Peter OSullivan, the Resettlement Officer in the Europe Bureau of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, based in Brussels. I'd like to start, as is our usual practice, with a housekeeping note for this webinar. First, let me remind you that the audio cast from the webinar will be on the MPI website later today. That's at www.migrationpolicy.org/events. And for any technical problems that you may have during the course of the webinar, please email to events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can call this U.S. number, area code 202-266-1929. If you have problems hearing via the web, via your computer, you can dial in using the call-in information that was sent to you earlier via email. After the presentations, we'll have a written Q&A at the end of the call, not a voice Q&A. So please type any questions that you may have into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen, or you can email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. You can also tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. The paper that's the starting point for today's discussion is called Taking Stock of Refugee Resettlement, Policy Objectives, Practical Trade-offs, and the Evidence-Based. It was commissioned as part of an EU capacity building project known as the European Union Action on Facilitating Resettlement and Refugee Admission Through New Knowledge, which has the clever acronym of EU-FRANK. The project is led by Sweden. It's financed by the European Asylum, Migration, and Integration Fund. As you all know, this webinar takes place against the backdrop of a record number of people displaced worldwide, living as refugees or internally displaced people, often for generations. There is a revitalized international focus on finding solutions for refugees, including a renewed interest in resettlement. Later, throughout this coming year and into 2018, member states of the United Nations will be negotiating a global compact for refugees. And that, I think we can expect with some confidence, will include a push for more resettlement internationally. At the same time, however, there's growing skepticism in some quarters domestically about the value and indeed sometimes the safety of resettling refugees. So there's a great deal of public education to be done, and governments have little room to experiment. They need to be very sure from the beginning that what they're doing is effective. And that makes a paper such as the one we're going to discuss today extremely timely, and I have no doubt that it will be very useful to governments as they contemplate their course of action. So I'm now going to give the floor to Susan Fratsky and Hannah Behrens to present the main findings of the paper and the sort of rationale for this project. Susan is going to start. She is a policy analyst and program coordinator with MPI's international program. Her research focuses on forced migration, on resettlement, on European Union asylum policy, as well as on vocational training and labor market integration. Susan has worked for the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and prior to that in the field in an adult literacy program serving immigrant and refugee students in Minnesota. She'll be followed by Hannah Behrens, who is, as I mentioned, is Associate Director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe. Hannah specializes in European Union policies related to asylum and migration, to human trafficking, and youth. Before she joined us here at MPI, she worked as a lead managing consultant for ICF Consulting, where much of her work was with and for the European Commission, with a particular focus on EU asylum and migration policy, and she worked closely with the European Migration Network. You will have their fuller biographies on the screen as each of them speaks, but it's now my pleasure to turn this virtual floor over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I wanted to start just by providing a very brief context for our project. As Kathleen mentioned, EU-FRANC is a multi-country EU project led by Sweden that aims to develop new approaches and provide operational support to increase the capacity of EU countries to undertake resettlement. And the support is targeted at both new and existing countries, so those wishing to scale up their efforts as well as those wishing to undertake resettlement for the first time. EU-FRANC aims to provide support in a few different areas, some of which are operational and practical tools for actually conducting and undertaking resettlement and collaborating between EU member states. There's also a research component to the project, which aims to provide policymakers with the information that they need to develop an effective resettlement process. As Kathleen mentioned, there's increasing interest both within the EU and globally on how to do resettlement, and the aim of the research component is really to provide policymakers with the information that they need to do that in the most effective and efficient way possible. And this report is the first component of that research goal. The report draws on the literature, a comprehensive review of the literature on the resettlement process with really three main aims. The first is to determine what the central questions and trade-offs are that resettlement practitioners and governments face in designing and operating resettlement programs. Secondly, we wanted to examine the knowledge and evidence that exists with regard to the practice of resettlement globally. What do we already know about how resettlement is done? And third, to evaluate how well that existing evidence serves the needs of resettlement policymakers and practitioners and identify evidence gaps that could be filled better. Today we'll briefly walk you through the findings of the report. I'll start by looking at the questions and pressing information needs that we identified, and then we'll turn it over to Hannah to walk you through the state of the current research and some of our recommendations for filling these knowledge gaps. Broadly, the key design questions that we identified fall into four main categories. The first, and perhaps the most important, is simply the question of what are the goals of a resettlement effort and what does this mean for program design. This may seem like a fairly straightforward question to ask, but it can actually be one of the major challenges in undertaking resettlement in a really effective and efficient way. The specific and detailed goals of the resettlement program are rarely articulated in detail, and complicating matters further, the plethora of actors involved in the resettlement process, from UNHCR to international and domestic NGOs to national governments themselves, may not always have the exact same goals for undertaking a particular resettlement initiative. And where these goals do differ, they aren't always mutually reinforcing, although that doesn't necessarily mean they're specifically in conflict. For example, most resettlement efforts are underpinned by a very clear moral imperative to help individuals in need. The UNHCR handbook describes resettlement as first and foremost a tool for protecting those whose safety and fundamental rights are at risk, and for international NGOs and the UN, this is often the principal motivator of resettlement programs. But government motivations may be a bit more complex. And we've seen this throughout the history of resettlement programs. Foreign policy interests were, of course, a main motivator for resettlement efforts, often during the Cold War. More recently, governments have sometimes had asylum or migration management goals in mind. We saw that, for example, in the agreement to increase settlement places out of Turkey that the EU reached in 2016. And while undertaking resettlement for different reasons isn't inherently problematic in and of itself, you can, of course, still save lives and provide people with protection while also achieving foreign policy goals. Having clear and broadly agreed upon goals is important for navigating the details and nuance of program design. The question of who to resettle is one particular design issue that illustrates this very clearly. While resettlement is often agreed to be a tool for protecting the most vulnerable, that's the primary aim of most resettlement programs. Within governments, the actors who are engaged in integration of refugees might say that ensuring refugees are self-sufficient as quickly as possible is their primary aim. And we know from the research that's been done on refugee integration that oftentimes highly vulnerable individuals may have problems entering the labor market quickly or quickly becoming self-sufficient. So those two goals can at times be in tension. Secondly, the second issue we identified is how to balance resource and capacity constraints with the desire to have a strategic impact. So where goals are articulated, how do you ensure you're achieving them? And this particularly can be a challenge for small-scale programs. Most EU programs resettle just a few hundred people per year. And if your goal, for example, is to improve conditions in the first asylum country, that can be very difficult to do if you have a program that's only resettling 200 or 300 people. This is one of the arguments that's been made for collaborating between resettlement countries to set common priorities and really target resettlement efforts. And this is something that's increasingly been a point of interest in the EU context. For example, the July 2015 EU resettlement scheme set priority regions for resettlements that EU countries could target together. The third question that we identified is how to ensure that resettlement is done as efficiently as possible without sacrificing any of the standards of care for refugees, as well as the oversight and management obligations that governments have. As Kathleen mentioned, with the current political situation in many countries, the stakes are very high to make sure that the resettlement process is well managed and that refugees are properly screened and vetted. But managing a comprehensive resettlement process from start to finish can be extremely resource and time intensive, particularly for smaller or newer resettlement countries. Resettlement involves reviewing refugee claims for protection, vetting them for security concerns, conducting medical examinations, arranging travel, and doing all of this often requires the help of an interpreter or highly trained staff on the ground. And particularly for smaller scale programs, the level of investment needed can be a barrier to entry. So this is another argument that's been brought forward, again, for pooling capacity in certain areas, for example, sharing interpreters or interviewers on the ground, or cooperating on transportation arrangements. Final question we identified is how to facilitate refugees' success after resettlement. Integration is a major concern for resettlement countries, not just in its own right, but because demonstrating the success of earlier cohorts of refugees is really critical to maintaining public support for resettlement. Policymakers face questions such as when and where to invest. Is it better to invest before refugees even depart for resettlement countries? What are the relative benefits of that? What rights and benefits and services do refugees need to be granted after arrival? We have very little information on how resettled refugees' needs in particular differ from other groups, what particular services are most beneficial to them. And finally, where should refugees be resettled? There's a trade-off in many resettlement countries between the areas where affordable housing is available and the areas where there's the most economic opportunity. So there's a need to examine really what the geographic impact of resettlement in particular locations is for policymakers to make informed decisions on housing for resettled refugees. Of course, answering all four of these questions requires a comprehensive evidence-based assessment of the relative merits and drawbacks and costs of various approaches. And I'll now turn it over to Hannah to give you more detail on what exactly we actually know about the resettlement process.
Thank you, Susan. Well, at present, monitoring and evaluating resettlement programs is not a standard practice, let alone one that is done in a very regular manner. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, there may be a lack of a general monitoring and evaluation tradition in public programs. But also when there is a desire to monitor or evaluate, the data may simply not be available or of a lower quality. So, for example, administrative data at present may not always identify individuals by immigration status, or if they do, then they do not distinguish between resettled refugees and other categories of individuals who come in through the national asylum system. And thirdly, some of the research strategies that have been used to date are not well developed to actually pursue some of these research goals. So if we then look at what data is available at present, we can see that the collection and analysis of data has been mainly steered by three aims. The first one is to inform the public on what resettlement is and how it is organized. The second one is to account for public expenditure on resettlement. And the third one has been to provide an overview of the different practices that each resettlement program has deployed over time. And in that respect, the databases from the European Resettlement Network, the AIDA database, and also the UNHCR resettlement country chapters have been very informative in actually capturing the diversity of practices. But however, there are a number of data gaps that need to be addressed. If, as Susan says, policymakers are able to navigate the maze of program decisions and the trade-offs that need to be investigated and explored. So a first one is to better define goals of resettlement programs. So in that respect, a step that could be undertaken is to conduct a survey with all relevant stakeholders and to explore with them what are the potential goals we want to set for our resettlement program, and can we agree on those to a certain extent. Once those are agreed, we can then actually start operationalizing them, meaning trying to think about how we would be able to pick up the degree to which these goals are attained. And then thirdly, we would have to develop an intervention logic, which would mean that we would be able to link up the program activities with the desired goals and actually find a way, a strategy to actually then make sure that we can track progress in this respect. In a second step, it would be really important to start establishing a monitoring and evaluation strategy that is able to examine the degree to which a resettlement program has been relevant in terms of its goals. So the question is here, is the program the one that is best suited to pursue the goals that we have set for our resettlement program? Were we clear in communicating with UNHCR as to the profile of the person we would want to resettle? The second question is, has it been effective? So is this the program that has been able to attain the goals that we had set ourselves? And finally, is this a program that has optimized the use of human and financial resources in pursuing those very goals? And in this respect, the fact that there's a number of resettlement programs being set up at present, or that current resettlement programs are being expanded, is a perfect moment for actually really reflecting on how can we set up such a strategy. And the Canadian example in this respect is really a powerful one. Thirdly, there is really an urgent need for better insights into human and financial resources currently invested in resettlement programs. In our research, we found that there's been very little attempts to either document or calculate costs for resettling refugees. There have been attempts by the European Migration Network or also by the OECD to try and capture what it costs to resettle a refugee. But they have all come to the conclusion that at present, states do not have the data to respond to any disaggregation of costs or cost breakdown. And there's also, at present, a clear risk of abuse of what figures or estimates that are currently available. So we see comparisons being made between costs among different resettlement programs, but we also see comparisons being made between different components of the international protection regime, where cost of resettling a refugee is compared with the cost of actually keeping the refugee in the first asylum country, which brings along some really pertinent and tricky questions. So again, the fact that several new programs are being set up is actually a perfect moment to think about how can we collect data and make sure that it's disaggregated so that the necessary cost calculations can be done. Fourthly, we need to take steps to better understand how to integrate resettled refugees. If you compare it to the research that has been conducted in this area and the documentation that is available, this has been really a major focus for evaluations and for academic research. But there are some key questions that still remain. How reliable are research results if evaluations are actually merely a snapshot and are done, for example, primarily by using subjective assessment tools? How valid are those research results if we are using definitions of success of integration that are actually used for other migrant categories? Can we work with a benchmark of economic self-sufficiency if the aim of the program has been to resettle the most vulnerable? And finally, a very important question, how do we know that the successes or the setbacks that we have seen in terms of integrating resettled refugees can be attributed to the program design, to the decisions we as program and policymakers have made in setting up our program? So the overall conclusion that we can make is that we need to better understand the different links of the resettlement chain, how the different resettlement phases interact with one another and affect one another, and ultimately affect the outcomes and the impact that we see with our resettlement program. And this is so important because this is the basis for us to better inform and improve the design and adaptation of resettlement programs, and to make sure that any political commitments that are made for setting up or expanding resettlement programs can be done in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan and Hannah. These are indeed big challenges and questions that you put before us. I'd like to remind people who are following us to submit their questions in writing through the Q&A or chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, or emailing us to events@migrationpolicy.org, or tweeting your question to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. Now I'd like to bring in Oscar Ekblad, whom, as I mentioned, is the Deputy Director of the Swedish Migration Agency and head of its Refugee Resettlement Program. He oversees the planning and the implementation of the resettlement program in Sweden, which brings in 3,400 people a year. That, of course, is on top of the very large numbers of asylum seekers that Sweden has received in the last few years. Oscar also manages the joint operations between the Swedish Migration Agency and the Swedish National Security Services to make sure that there's smooth interoperability between the Migration Agency and the security agencies. Sweden is very active on refugee resettlement, not only at home, but in international organizations. And on behalf of the Swedish government, Oskar has served as chair of the UNHCR core group on resettlement from Syria, of the Geneva-based tripartite consultations on resettlement, and has a deep background in asylum law and humanitarian law. So, Oskar, I'd love to hear from you about how these issues play out in the work of the Swedish Migration Agency.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you, MPI, Susan and Hannah, for the very thorough work that's been put into this study. Obviously, it's something that's being commissioned within the framework of the EU Frank project, something that is placed very, very close to our heart here at the Swedish Migration Agency, being so involved in the project. But it does also take, if I may say, an outside look on us, the practitioners in resettlement, to an extent where I may even say I may blush sometimes, perhaps, on what is listed in the report, because it is a comprehensive study, inking down very much on paper many of the truths that I think many of us who's been involved for a few years have identified as important, and some things and areas where we wish to go further. But I can say that many of these areas for research has gone virtually untouched, and I think especially when the report mentions areas of perhaps more descriptive research, it is a bit of a perhaps failure on us who drive the processes from the operational perspective to also make sure that we underlie our work with thorough, demonstratively working methods at the end of the day, and policies that achieve the goals that are important. I guess we're just saved by the bell here by the fact that we are introducing these kind of studies through the MPI into the project, and hope that these will be some of the really contributing factors to at least the European onset of a resettlement activity that is much wider in scope than it has been in the past. It is interesting, obviously, in that aspect also to read some of the very outspoken and very good mentioning of twinning and capacity building and other operational projects that we have become experts in undertaking, including the EU Frank project itself, I may say, where the authors obviously refer to these as welcome, but relying solely on such efforts comes with some risks. And we're happy that we're being very well made aware of these risks through this paper. On the policy level, which is thoroughly put into our operational level through this research, I think we've definitely seen the same kind of lack in coherent underpinning or basing of the goals and achievements that we think or want to see that we do, with some sort of research-based analysis of this is how it works. And I was especially struck by, obviously, the outcome or the study on why we do resettlement. We should, I guess, by now, having had a program since 1950, know why we do resettlement. But frankly, I think from the Swedish perspective, and underlying very much our input into the European discussion, resettlement has come as a partnership with the UN, and we have dealt very little with the fact of the motivations why it's being done in any longer perspective than to assist refugees in the UN in that system. I'd like to bring in, obviously, one of the most important outcomes for our program, which is individual protection. And I see sometimes in this study that perhaps more the strategic and the overall policy objectives are the ones that's being stressed. And for us, it has, in all aspects, been an endeavor about individuals' protection. Now, rightfully, the level of reaching the most vulnerable individuals and reaching protection at the highest and most efficient level is still not researched and still not very thoroughly documented. And I can't say that our own policy is based with a resounding, thoughtful underpinning, other than we get obviously the feedback from the UN that it is contributing results on the ground. But I understand, and from this paper very much, that there are multitudes of ways of increasing the value and understanding how our program works. I welcome the discussion on longitudinal and other data. And even though Sweden, mentioned in the report together with Canada, do have some of that data on integration, I think for us it's still very much not relevant to the operational aspects of resettlement. We don't use that to take that into account as much as perhaps could be used into the actual design of the program. That might be in part because Sweden has chosen not to couple integration with the actual selection of individuals, again based solely on the UNHCR identification of individual and group-based protection needs. For us, one of the challenges is that we don't have a national actor who can act to disseminate this issue and go through research and put up statistics and so forth. And if we don't have it, I'm guessing there are other countries who don't have this as well. And that's obviously an interesting factor that we would like to look into further. It may be very resource intensive, but I think there are some good traits if we can further research in that area. Generally, the study is very welcome to us, and we see great need here for, in the European context, to use this study to go forward, to now effectivize some of these findings from the MPI to go forward and get that result there. Because when reading it, I want to have some of this result to base policies on as much as I can, remembering obviously that we work with the operational side of and the government and the politicians obviously design the program on the larger and aggregated level. Some challenges, perhaps just very broadly, and we fend obviously for Sweden's right to determine priorities and legal prerequisites of our own program. It's not that we don't understand that the European harmonization of rules can bring a lot of value, and if it does, I don't think Sweden, I'm not privy to know exactly how the politicians will act in this sense, but Sweden will, of course, are seeking a European joint endeavor in resettlement. But it has also to be something that is worthwhile, so that there are developments that bring substantially better levels of resettlement and so forth. Because for us still, there are national interests and integrities that we need to maintain, and sometimes I think that they might be overstated, the differences. I've seen many examples in this work where UNHCR is able to use the national differences to its advantage. And I think that the multifaceted world of resettlement may also bring some strength. And I just want to make sure that that's kind of remain in the picture. I also just generally want to say when we have been able to put these longitudinal research, the evaluation of resettlement process itself, the improvement of documentation and analysis of the cost of resettlement, and obviously the integration outcomes, I think we'll be faced with a new set of questions. There'll be other issues and complexities that will rise through the roof. And I think two of the questions that I think will come up is if there is a need for a strategic impact at the end of the day, or if resettlement can also play a role in just providing protection for individuals. Now that in itself has to be monitored and make sure it works, and if there are other alternatives, that has to be checked. But the strategic impact may sometimes be slightly overstated. And following on that, is there a risk of over-design? I think when we look at recent initiatives in the resettlement context, we are strongly trying to find everything that simplifies and makes resettlement more accessible. And there is definitely a risk that the complexities and the multifaceted linkages that exist in resettlement can also lead to a very, very complex system if we don't make sure to safeguard some of the simplistic truths in this line of work, which is to bring swiftly people under protection in a third country. Again, thank you very much for the report. It's really providing us with a lot of insight and providing the project with a much needed policy aspect so that we may perhaps be able to do this peer-to-peer learning that is intended in EU Frank with some sustained impact in the long run. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Oscar, for those really insightful and challenging remarks. I think it's important as EU Frank and MPI as part of that goes through additional research questions that we think keep very much in mind these sort of real-world questions. And I'm very pleased to ask Peter O'Sullivan to join the conversation now, as he too has a real-world perspective on these issues. As I said earlier, Peter is the resettlement officer for UNHCR's Bureau for Europe. And the Bureau for Europe is an important advocate for resettlement in Europe, as well as bringing its vast experience to bear on the qualities and the outcomes of resettlement programs in different countries. The office has also been very active in exploring the possibilities of complementary pathways to settlement for refugees, things like community-based sponsorship, private sponsorship programs, study opportunities, labor migration schemes, and so on. Peter himself brings deep field experience to these questions. He's worked on development and conflict and human rights issues in many different parts of the world, including his own country of Ireland, in India, Lesotho, the Gaza Strip, and now the really tough posting, Brussels. So, Peter, let me ask you to come in here and talk about the importance of these data and information gaps and the efforts that UNHCR is making to encourage more countries to develop resettlement programs.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you to Hannah, Susan, for the comprehensive overview you provided of the research earlier. It's an extremely useful document, I must say, and I had a chance to read it quickly, but I had a chance to read it, and I found it very, very informative. And I will say that Brussels is a difficult posting compared to other places I've been. I will maybe just give a perspective from UNHCR on with respect to what the MPI research has sought to do, is just to, I suppose, emphasize that, you know, given the limited number of resettlement places that are available globally, which are well known, coupled with increasing needs, the primary need that we see is for increased resettlement quotas and programs. However, key to that, of course, is that such programs that they're well conceived and that they're sustainable. And we've, actually as recently as 2013, we launched a publication at the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement, which is the annual resettlement meeting that takes place in Geneva with governments, NGOs, UNHCR and other international organizations. And we, through this very admittedly brief publication, we try to identify the fundamental factors that need to be in place to ensure that our resettlement program is sustainable. And this, in ideal terms, reflects much of what the MPI report is identifying, though, of course, doesn't really identify all those factors in themselves. So it's resettlement entrenched in legislation and policy instruments, a responsive integration program, as well as supportive and hospitable, welcoming communities. As Kathleen, you've mentioned, like through the Bureau for Europe, but of course through Geneva with the resettlement service and UNHCR's global policy, for many years we've been advocating for increased resettlement opportunities, for increased resettlement to the EU, Resettlement efforts to the EU are admittedly numerically modest in comparison to the global intake, but it is increasing year on year over the past number of years, which is positive. The latest statistics we have, according to Eurostat for 2016, is that 14,205 persons were resettled to the EU, which was twice the number that it was in 2015. So that is positive, yet we still think that more can be done. However, when we're encouraging states to consider resettlement programs, neither is it at any cost. The states have an obligation to ensure that the programs that they're well conceived, that they're protection-centred, and that they're responsive to the needs of refugees, and of course responsive to the needs that UNHCR seeks to identify on an annual basis through what we call the Projected Global Resettlement Needs publication. We have, and the MPI report acknowledges this, we have seen in certain limited circumstances secondary movements of resettled refugees from one EU member state to another. This is, of course, highly undesirable and is to the benefit of absolutely nobody. So I kind of repeat that it's incumbent on states, in cooperation with all relevant national actors, through regular consultation, stakeholder cooperation, to undertake all of the proper planning from the outset. On the MPI report, like the themes identified are extremely relevant, and perhaps it doesn't go as far as to the extent of what the report identifies, but maybe just as a point of note, and maybe this kind of reflects the challenges that have been, and Oscar kind of mentioned this too, in responding to some of those items identified. The 2009 annual tripartite consultations on resettlement, UNHCR made a proposal at that time to undertake the development of a tool to measure the post-arrival outcomes of resettlement. Okay, so it's the post-arrival aspect. Nevertheless, it of course has an impact on ultimately on the entire resettlement continuum, as we call it, and this was to begin with a longitudinal analysis using a series of key indicators that were to measure both quantitative and qualitative outcomes for resettlement. The intention was the analysis would involve states, NGOs, and UNHCR, but the proposal actually didn't go any further than that because it didn't find support amongst the majority of resettlement states who expressed concerns that the measuring process would become too burdensome, that to do so would take time away from the service delivery itself, the challenge in itself of how to measure the outcomes, and the suggestion of the potential misuse of data for political purposes. And maybe just to say that in response to what MPI has identified, we may see similar argumentation made in that regard. With regards to the report too, it makes reference to the priority setting at the international level, and I've mentioned the ATCR, as we call it for short, which is the central gathering, I would say, of UNHCR with states, NGOs, and international partners on an annual basis. And I suppose it's at that level we try to identify that priority setting and to say these are the populations in need of resettlement, and that is supported by this Projected Global Resettlement Needs publication. And with that, we seek to assist states in being able to, I suppose, identify their selection priorities, but also that, of course, entails a lot of bilateral discussions with UNHCR to ensure that what states are seeking to do is in response to needs. And of course, states will have, as the MPI report acknowledges, will prioritise even further within the respective submission categories that we see that UNHCR will submit under. But all in all, it really is to try and, I suppose, given what I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that we're in a situation where we have resettlement needs that are far outstripping the available places, and in 2017 we had close to 1.2 million persons in need of resettlement. The need there is to ensure that what we do is strategic, and that requires a high level of negotiation, discussions, both in a multilateral setting, but also at the bilateral setting. And as I said, through the resettlement service in Geneva, those efforts are continuing on a daily basis, I would say. But what I acknowledge too with the MPI report, aside from what UNHCR tries to do to assist states, well, through, for example, it was mentioned in the presentation earlier about the resettlement handbook and the country chapters, resettlement statistics that are available now through a new portal we've just recently launched. The MPI report is addressing this kind of root and branch approach, so making the link between resettlement processes, methodologies, the outcomes for refugees themselves, and also what were the original objectives or the intentions of the state when it identified its resettlement priorities. It was maybe just to touch too on EU Frank, which of course UNHCR is a partner to the project, and very much we're delighted to be a partner to the project. I think EU Frank is already displaying the value it can bring in addressing existing gaps that we see in knowledge and research through commissioning the MPI to do this study. It's both in identifying the baseline from which we're currently operating from, as well as to populate the gaps that we see going forward. I think the fact that it's focused on new resettlement states is key. The reference to it, the first presentation was made to the July conclusions of 2015 and the European Union efforts, and there we saw 27 member states voluntarily commit to resettling refugees, and that reflected 11 member states who had never resettled previously, and that's of course extremely positive. But as I was saying at the beginning, it needs to ensure too that these programs are well thought out, that they're well conceived. I think what EU Frank can do, and what through this research as well, it can support greater efforts towards essentially full disclosure on the various factors that must be taken into account when pursuing resettlement. And as I said, if this can be further supported through this component of the EU Frank project, this can only be to the betterment of such efforts, and ultimately, which is where we want to go, is we want to see an expansion of the resettlement community. The report also acknowledges the fact that we are seeing a reduced resettlement intake from the United States. Of course, this has a significant impact globally. The United States is by far the biggest contributor to resettlement. So we absolutely need to see improved efforts or greater efforts from all involved, and to expand the resettlement community. Maybe I'll also just mention the Emerging Resettlement Countries Joint Support Mechanism, or the ERCM for short. And this was launched in September of last year at the Leaders Summit, and UNHCR is implementing this mechanism in cooperation with IOM. And just maybe touching on some of the aspects that the MPI report identifies, for example, the evaluation process of resettlement and how this influences resettlement outcomes. In fact, a prerequisite to be assisted by this ERCM is that the governments involved, as part of their program design, that they introduce monitoring and evaluation elements to the program. And this will then allow them to regularly evaluate the impact of it, including the pre-departure aspects and cultural orientation, which of course is typically provided by IOM. On the identification and agreement on the strategic goals, I mentioned earlier the engagement with the ATCR. That is something perhaps that needs to be further developed, and take note to what Oscar was saying earlier. The MPI report does make reference to solidarity, responsibility sharing, and from our perspective, that reflects what we see as one of the three core functions of resettlement, alongside it as a durable solution and a tool of protection. And then on investing in comparative analytical assessment of resettlement efforts, we absolutely see the value in ensuring that there's, rather than kind of trying to match apples with oranges, that it's oranges with oranges or bananas with bananas, whatever you want, pick your fruit, but ultimately that that there has to be commonality really in the legislative policy frameworks that ensure that there is the room there for complementarity and for learning. We have seen twinning practices in the past, and they have not really, I think, from what I know, essentially been evaluated either. So that is important to ensure that, and I know with EU Frank that is an intention to try and also make those linkages between states, and I think that could be very beneficial, but of course as long as it's again well conceived. And finally, I might just make reference to other mechanisms, such as the mechanism but project, the European Resettlement Network, which was mentioned in the presentation. UNHCR has been cooperating closely with IOM and ICMC over a number of years on trying to improve the resettlement landscape in Europe, in expanding resettlement opportunities, encouraging states to resettle, whether to increase or to resettle for the first time. And that's been the European Commission funded over many years, and we very much look forward to the opportunity and we have been discussing this, to cooperating with EU Frank in ensuring that we can also lend the expertise that we've developed over the years in supporting new resettlement states, whether through the previous research that we've undertaken, and also in complement to that, it's the current project is focusing on complementary pathways. And I think it's also an acknowledgement that when we're talking about resettlement, it can no longer exist in a vacuum. That there's the absolute need to expand the opportunities that exist for persons, so that they do not feel compelled to take a treacherous boat journey through the Mediterranean Humanitarian, and that includes, as Kathleen mentioned, private sponsorship programs, student scholarship schemes, humanitarian mission programs. I would say it's a non-exhaustive list, and we would very much encourage states to pursue that. I will stop there, Kathleen, because I probably have gone over my time, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that look at, which is quite an encouraging look, I think, at the kind of research that is ongoing, and certainly the recognition for the need for further exploration of these issues. I think you have actually already answered one of the questions that came in just as you started to speak, which was, is UNHCR aware of the monitoring and evaluation gaps in the resettlement program, and how do they propose to address them? I think you have. I think you've given us an answer on that. that these are very much front of mind, and that you have already been trying to persuade states to do more in this area. We had a comment rather than a question also that came in relating to the emerging resettlement country joint support mechanism, which the comment is that IOM is exploring integration strategies through a process that involves many stakeholders, and that it does indeed anticipate that integration goals and indicators will play a part in that. So let me move to a question, I think, for Susan and Hannah. The question that came in was, based on the data that you have looked at, what integration investments do you think produce the best results? Susan, do you want to start on that? And since we have a number of questions, let me ask you all to keep your answers fairly short.
Sure. Well, I can be very brief, and then we'll turn it over to Hannah. One thing I think that we at MPI are quite interested in exploring at the moment, that's an interesting strategy, is the use of community-based initiatives to welcome and support refugees, and this includes things like Canada's model of private sponsorship of refugees, or the recent community support model that's been introduced in the UK. And as Hannah mentioned, there's not a huge amount of evaluation yet specifically either on this or on other strategies in terms of how policies play into outcomes. But there's some interesting opportunities within this model in particular. Canada just introduced a process where they'll be able to compare the outcomes of refugees in the community-based private sponsorship program, where refugees are matched with community hosts who provide them with mentorship and guidance and support with refugees who come through the normal resettlement process. So I think we'll have in the next few years, there will be some interesting data to draw on in terms of how that model in particular, a model that requires very individualized support and mentorship, impacts the integration process.
Hannah, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think in relation to the recent influx in Europe, there's also been more and more interest by different countries to also explore the possibility of distributing refugees across local authorities or across regions. And there again, there's been some really good examples of how services are adapted, but it's also quite a crucial one in terms of thinking through what kind of service provision has to be given, and also to make sure that it's linked up with then other integration outcomes in terms of making sure that children can have access to schools, that adults have access to employment. So those kind of reflections is something that's also a lot of attention is being paid at for the moment.
Thanks, Hannah. I would just add, that there has been quite a lot of sort of controversy on integration strategies, I think provoked by the contrast between the U.S. and Europe, where in the U.S. the tremendous emphasis on early employment for resettled refugees has really not only been a sort of fiscal policy, but also based on a belief that getting people into work is a very effective integration strategy, that it forces them to interact with the native-born and sort of gets them out into the real world rather than being sheltered in special programs for refugees. So it's an interesting ongoing question. There's a question here that I'd like to address to Oscar, based on your experience in Sweden over, as you mentioned, a long period of resettling refugees. And the question is, what cultural orientation practices would you recommend to promote long-term integration and public support for refugee resettlement? Do I need to repeat the question, or?
No. Thank you very much. This is Oscar. The question is very timely, and it's a question that I am asking myself, and my staff we're asking together. We've actually are in the process of remodeling our own CO programs in Sweden, because frankly we think that we may not be up to fit for purpose, if I may say, for the aim that this question is coming from, which is, basically to provide the best kind of start that promotes long-term results. So in the study, there's a very interesting outlay of the two types of cultural orientation that basically can exist. It's one that's pretty resource intensive, carried out in the field pre-departure, and the Norwegian program is mentioned, and one that we're looking at, obviously. The other one is post-arrival, which I guess is mentioned here by the New Zealand example. And I've found in the last couple of years, it's very interesting that such great resettling countries as Norway and New Zealand can come to very different conclusions when it comes to this issue. We see the value of cultural orientation. It is really important, but I guess at this moment in time, this is exactly what we need in the European Union. First research and a policy, and then a sound operating system around this. And I think there might have been, at least in the past from our own agency, more of an effort of just going along with what we had. IOM has provided some great insights into this area. They know most, I guess, on the operational aspect. But I would welcome a real research that would actually answer this question. What is the best? I don't know. Sorry.
Great. Well, thank you for that honest assessment, and also for emphasizing the importance of really finding out what is working and what isn't. On the sort of cultural orientation front, I think it is shrouded still in quite a lot of mystery. We have one comment relating to that, which is that the pursuit of efficient program design and political sustainability is one goal. Much higher level of scrutiny is needed to identify larger purposes, as well as measuring successful outcomes of resettlement. Often efforts are shrouded in benevolence, and the true costs and benefits aren't known or analyzed when looking at the higher purposes. I think that relates to some of your earlier remarks, Oscar, and it is certainly food for thought. Here's one question which I'd like to address to Peter, which is whether an overall policy for evaluating refugees' qualifications is an example of a good investment in refugee integration. What are your thoughts about that? Should refugees' qualifications be assessed early on in the resettlement process?
We say pre-acceptance or post-arrival.
I think this question is post-arrival. I don't think
post-arrival.
the
I thought maybe. Okay, I thought maybe in the context of integration potential.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. No, thank you. I suppose it's linked to what you were discussing earlier too with Hannah and Susan. The integration discussion is a very difficult, complicated one, and I think the qualification recognition absolutely is extremely important. We've seen through our own research, and not specifically on resettled refugees, because as the MPI report also acknowledges, the specific research data or information on resettled refugees is more limited. It generally is assessed in kind of the broader discussion around refugees and third country nationals. But certainly for refugees, like they see, and the discussion earlier was around employment, but also language acquisition, housing, appropriate housing, and I think you can't talk about one issue in isolation when you're talking about integration, because they're all interlinked. One feeds into the other. And on the discussion earlier about this, perhaps in some contexts, an overemphasis on the employment aspects and the economic independence. I can see the rationale for that, but I think what we're also seeing through initial discussions with that colleagues are undertaking with some countries in Europe is that this emphasis, or perhaps overemphasis on employment, is actually to the detriment of other aspects of the integration process. So yes, absolutely, qualification recognition is extremely important, as it is linked to employment prospects, but also as it's linked to obviously language acquisition and all these factors. So I think they can't be discussed in isolation. They're all extremely important in ensuring that persons, when they arrive, refugees, that they are given every opportunity to excel essentially in their new communities. And it's a difficult process. It's a long process, and we talk about the two-way process, and that is extremely important. But it means, and when we're talking about the development of resettlement programs, and I know the EU-FRANC project doesn't necessarily focus on the integration aspects, the post-arrival phase of that, but it's really from A to Z, that the resettlement program has to be conceived so that all of these aspects are fully considered.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that really sort of comprehensive answer. We have one comment came in pointing out that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all when it comes to pre-departure orientation, and that's one of the reasons that IOM maintains a range of different models. But I think this is clearly a topic that merits further reflection and research. I'm afraid we are out of time, essentially. There was one question about the adequacy of psychosocial programs in the U.S. resettlement program, whether it's effectively addressing the needs of war-traumatized refugees. I think that's it's a very good question. I don't think we really have time to answer it fully, but just to say that all of the U.S. programs for refugee resettlement are under severe strain because of its budget cuts, not just starting now, but going over the last several years. And I think none of the resettlement agencies would argue that they have adequate provision for psychosocial needs, even though they try to address them. I am unfortunately compelled to close this very interesting discussion as we're out of time. I'd like to thank the audience and particularly thank our four speakers, and Oscar and Peter, you've really added a number of extremely important dimensions to the discussion of this paper. I'd like to remind you all that there are many resources related to refugee resettlement on the MPI website at migrationpolicy.org, that the audio from today's webinar will be available at migrationpolicy.org/events later today, and that you can find the report that was discussed today available on our website, which we invite you to visit. Again, the address is migrationpolicy.org. The paper was commissioned as part of the European Union Action on Facilitating Resettlement and Refugee Admission Through New Knowledge, the EU-FRANC project, funded by the European Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund and led by Sweden. For any reporters on the call who need more information, we invite you to call Michelle Middlestat at +44208-123-6265 or email mmiddlestat@migrationpolicy.org. Again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Susan and Hannah, for this extremely relevant and timely research. And thank you, Oscar and Peter, for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you very much, Kathleen.